Here is something that should bother you. Over 200 ancient civilizations that never met, never traded, never shared a single written word, all tell the same story. A great flood, a chosen survivor, a divine warning, a world wiped clean and reborn. The ancient Sumerians wrote it, the Babylonians wrote it, the Hebrews wrote it, the ancient Greeks wrote it, the Hindus wrote it, the Aztecs wrote it, the Maya wrote it. Aboriginal Australians passed it down in oral tradition for thousands of years. Indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest carved it into their memory. Ancient China has its own version. Ancient India has multiple versions. Even the Norse have a flood narrative woven into their mythology. Over 200 versions of the same story across every continent, separated by oceans, by deserts, by thousands of years. The question is not whether this story is widespread. That part is undeniable. The question is why? And the answer, depending on where you stand, is either the most comforting thing you will ever hear or the most unsettling. Welcome to First Beliefs. I am your host, and today we are going to follow the flood. Let us start with the version most of us know. Noah, the ark, 40 days and 40 nights of rain, the animals, 2 by 2, the dove with the olive branch, the rainbow. This version lives in the book of Genesis, and billions of people have grown up with it as part of their spiritual inheritance. But here is what most people do not know. The story of Noah is not the oldest version of the flood, not even close. Roughly 1,000 years before the book of Genesis reached its final form, a Babylonian poet carved the story onto clay tablets. That story is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And buried inside it, in what scholars call Tablet 11, is a flood narrative so strikingly similar to Noah that when it was first translated into English in 1872, it sent shockwaves through the entire Western world. The Babylonian flood hero is named Utnapishtim. He is warned by a god, specifically the god Ea, that a great flood is coming to destroy humanity. He is told to build a great boat. He brings his family aboard and he brings animals. The flood comes, the waters rise and cover the mountains. Everyone outside the boat perishes. When the waters begin to recede, Utnapishtim releases birds, first a dove, then a swallow, then a raven, to test whether dry land has appeared. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. He makes an offering to the gods. A covenant is made. You have read this before. The details are almost identical. But the Epic of Gilgamesh itself was drawing on an even older source, a Sumerian text called the Eridu Genesis, which tells of a flood hero named Ziusudra, a righteous king warned by the god Enki that a divine council had decided to destroy humanity. Ziusudra builds a great boat, survives, and is granted immortality. The Sumerians were writing about the flood before Abraham walked the earth, before Moses, before any of the stories we call scripture had been committed to writing. So, what are we supposed to do with this? There are essentially 3 roads you can take, and all 3 of them are worth walking. The first road is the one that takes the stories at face value. What if the flood actually happened? Not as myth, not as metaphor, but as a real, catastrophic, global, or at least regionally catastrophic event that ancient peoples witnessed, and remembered. This is not as far-fetched as it might sound, and in recent decades, geology has started to make it sound considerably less far-fetched. We know for a scientific fact that approximately 12,000 years ago, the Earth was emerging from the last ice age. Massive glaciers, some of them miles thick, were melting. And when they melted, they did not melt slowly and gently. They melted in catastrophic sudden pulses. Geologists have identified several periods of what they call meltwater pulses, events where enormous volumes of glacial meltwater flooded into the oceans in extremely short periods of geological time. One of the most significant of these, called Meltwater Pulse 1A, is believed to have raised global sea levels by somewhere between 13 and 24 feet in less than 500 years. Others may have been even faster. For coastal peoples and most ancient civilizations were built near water, an event like this would have been experienced as the end of the world. There is also the Black Sea hypothesis, proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the 1990s. Their theory is that around 7,500 years ago, the Mediterranean Sea breached a natural land barrier at what is now the Bosphorus Strait, flooding the Black Sea basin, which at the time was a freshwater lake sitting well below sea level in a catastrophic inundation. Their estimate is that water rushed in with a force 200 times greater than Niagara Falls, flooding the surrounding land at a rate of a mile a day. If there were people living in that basin, and they would have experienced something that looked, felt, and sounded exactly like the end of the world. A flood with no horizon, water as far as the eye could see, everything familiar swallowed. Their descendants would have told this story, and their descendants would have told it. And somewhere in that chain of telling, it became sacred, became scripture, became myth. This is one explanation for why the flood story is so concentrated in the ancient Near East, Mesopotamia, the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, the civilizations closest to the Black Sea basin, and closest to the coastlines most devastated by rising post-glacial seas. The story spread because the survivors spread. This explanation is compelling, it is scientifically grounded, and it does not require you to abandon faith to accept it. In fact, many believers find it deeply affirming. If the flood really happened, then every ancient tradition that remembered it was, in its own way, bearing witness to truth. The second road is the one taken by most historians and scholars of comparative religion. The flood myth did not arise independently in 200 cultures. It arose in one place, most likely ancient Mesopotamia, and then it traveled, carried by traders, by migrants, by conquering armies, by wandering priests, by the slow invisible currents of cultural exchange that have always connected human civilizations. This explanation has enormous power when we look at the specific similarities between ancient flood texts. The Hebrew flood narrative and the Babylonian flood narrative are not merely thematically similar, they share specific structural details: the divine warning, the righteous chosen survivor, the wooden vessel, the pitch to waterproof it, the release of birds, the resting on a mountain, the divine covenant afterward. The overlap is too precise to be coincidence. The scholarly consensus is that these stories share a common source, possibly a very ancient oral tradition that predates writing, possibly the Sumerian original. The Israelites lived in close proximity to Mesopotamian culture. They were famously exiled to Babylon in the 6th century before the Common Era, where they would have encountered the full Gilgamesh tradition firsthand. Many scholars believe the final written form of Genesis was shaped in part during this Babylonian exile, and that the Babylonian flood narrative left its fingerprints on the text. This does not mean the biblical flood story is merely borrowed. Cultural transmission is not plagiarism. Every civilization that received a story transformed it, infused it with their own theology, their own values, their own understanding of the relationship between the divine and the human. The Babylonian flood is about the whims of fickle gods who destroyed humanity almost on a whim, and who were angry that the flood noise had been so loud. The Hebrew flood is about a moral God who grieved over human wickedness, who chose a righteous man, and who made an everlasting covenant of mercy. Same structure, radically different theology. The story traveled, but it was transformed by every hand that carried it. And here is where I want to pause, because I think this matters spiritually, not just academically. If a story travels through 200 civilizations over 10,000 years, and every single one of them keeps it sacred, keeps it central, builds their cosmology around it, then the story is doing something. It is meeting a need so deep, so universal, so rooted in the human experience that no civilization can let it go. What need is that? This is the road I find most interesting, and it is the one that the scholars of religion and depth psychology have explored with extraordinary depth. The flood story is not just about water. It is about transformation through destruction. It is the story of an old world ending so that a new one can begin. Think about what the flood narrative always contains across every culture. First, a world that has become corrupt, a civilization that has lost its way, a humanity that has drifted from the sacred. Second, divine judgment, a reckoning, the recognition that things cannot continue as they are. Third, a remnant, one person, one family, one seed of something righteous, something worth preserving. Fourth, destruction, total, overwhelming, world-ending, the old structures swept away. And fifth, renewal, a new earth, a covenant, a rainbow, a second chance. This is not just the story of a historical flood. This is the story of every human soul that has ever had to rebuild itself from nothing. The theologian and philosopher Mircea Eliade, who spent his life studying the mythologies of the ancient world, argued that flood myths are cosmogonic myths, myths about the creation of the world. But they are creation myths with a twist. They are about the second creation, the world that comes after the end. We have all lived this story, maybe not in water, but in grief, in failure, in the collapse of something we built our identity around, in the loss of a faith that once felt solid, in the ending of a life chapter so complete that what came before feels like it belonged to a different person. The flood is the universal human experience of catastrophic loss, followed by the terrifying question, what now? And every civilization that ever lived answered that question the same way. You get in the boat. You carry what is worth carrying. You survive the waters, and then you step out onto new ground, and you build again. I want to stay on this road a little longer because as a Persian woman, the flood narrative is not abstract to me. In the Zoroastrian tradition, the ancient faith of my ancestors, there is a figure named Yima. He is the first king of a golden age, a time of paradise on earth. No death, no disease, no suffering. Animals and humans lived together in harmony. The earth was perfect. Then the wise god Ahura Mazda comes to Yima with a warning. Winter is coming. A terrible, world-destroying winter. Some scholars believe this refers to an ice age, others to a metaphysical age of spiritual cold. Whatever it is, it will kill everything alive. Ahura Mazda instructs Yima to build a Vara, an enclosure, a vast underground structure, a paradise built beneath the frozen earth. Into this Vara, Yima is told to bring the seeds of every plant, every animal, every human soul, the best of everything. A world saved inside a world. Notice what is different here. In the Zoroastrian version, it is not a flood that destroys the world. It is a cosmic winter. But the structure of the story is exactly the same. Divine warning. Righteous chosen one, vessel of preservation, world ending, and world saved. And this is not coincidental. Scholars who study Indo-Iranian mythology see clear connections between the Zoroastrian flood equivalent myth, the ancient Aryans who migrated across Central Asia and into Persia and India carried these stories with them. Each branch kept the shape of the original and filled it with their own sacred meaning. For me, standing at this intersection, this is not a threat to faith, it is an expansion of it. My ancestors looked at the same terrifying question: how do we survive the end of everything? And they answered it with the same profound trust. Someone will warn us. Someone will save what is worth saving. The divine has not abandoned us. Even in the cold and the dark, that is not mythology. That is theology. And it runs through every human civilization that ever buried its dead and wondered what came next. Let me take you around the world for a moment, because I think the sheer variety of flood narratives is one of the most fascinating things about them. In ancient India, the earliest Hindu scriptures, the Vedas, contain a flood story that predates much of the biblical tradition. The hero is Manu, the first man. He is washing his hands in a river when a small fish comes to him and asks for his protection. Manu saves the fish in a pot, and the fish grows larger and larger until he must be released into the ocean. Then the fish reveals himself to be the god Vishnu, and he warns Manu that a great flood is coming. He tells Manu to build a ship. The flood comes. Manu's ship is guided through the waters by the fish, now enormous, with a horn, until it comes to rest on a mountain in the far north. The story then says that Manu was the only survivor, and from him came all of humanity. He is, in Hindu tradition, the ancestor of the human race. His very name is the root of the word Manusya, meaning human being, and some scholars connect it to the word man itself. In ancient China, the flood hero is Gan and then his son Yu. The Chinese flood narrative is unusual in that it does not focus on escaping the flood but on taming it. Yu the Great, one of the founding heroes of Chinese civilization, spent 13 years redirecting rivers and draining floodwaters across the entire land. He worked so hard that his feet became calloused and his legs grew thin from constant walking. He became the founder of the first dynasty, the Xia, and is revered to this day as a model of selfless public service. The story is different in its resolution, not escape, but mastery. And yet the flood itself occupies the same cosmological position, the great water that tested the world, the great leader who saved it. In Mesoamerica, the Aztec cosmology describes a series of worlds or suns, each one destroyed and recreated. The fourth sun was destroyed by a flood. The human survivors were turned into fish by the gods. The fifth sun, our current world, was then created from the ashes of the fourth. The Maya Popol Vuh describes the first humans as failed creations, wooden people without souls or memory of the gods, swept away in a great rain and flood before true humanity was formed from corn. In the Pacific Islands, flood myths stretch from Hawaii to New Zealand to Fiji. Many of them involve a god angry at human behavior, a chosen people saved on a high mountain or a great canoe, and a world renewed after the waters recede. Aboriginal Australians carry some of the oldest oral traditions on earth, stretching back tens of thousands of years, and many of their flood stories may actually be memories of the catastrophic coastal flooding that followed the end of the last ice age, when sea levels rose by hundreds of feet and reshaped the Australian coastline permanently. These are not borrowed stories. They are indigenous, rooted, ancient, and yet they rhyme. So I want to bring all of this together now, because I think there is something deeply important being said across all of these traditions that we need to hear. Every flood story contains a moral architecture, and that architecture is remarkably consistent. The world is not permanent. Whatever civilization we build, however solid it feels, however eternal it seems, it is not permanent. The flood can come, the winter can come, the fire can come, the world we know can end. This is not pessimism, it is wisdom. Because embedded in every flood story is also the insistence that something survives. The righteous one, the seed, the covenant, the rainbow, the promise that after the waters recede, there is ground to stand on again. The ancient world was not trying to tell us that catastrophe is inevitable and therefore meaningless. It was trying to tell us that catastrophe is inevitable and therefore we must know what is worth preserving. What do you put in the boat? That is the question every flood story is really asking. When everything falls away, when the comfortable world you have built dissolves, what do you carry? What is worth saving? What survives the water? In the biblical tradition, Noah brings the animals. He brings life itself. In the Zoroastrian tradition, Yima brings the seeds of every living thing, but also the souls, the fravashis, of the righteous. In the Hindu tradition, Manu carries the sacred scriptures. In the Babylonian tradition, Utnapishtim carries his family, his craftsmen, his animals, the skills and relationships needed to rebuild a civilization. Each answer is different, but they are all answers to the same question, and they all reflect what each civilization understood to be most sacred. I think this is what makes the flood story impossible to kill. It is not just a memory of water. It is a meditation on what matters. And human beings have never stopped needing that meditation. Before we close, I want to address something directly, because I know it is in the room. If the biblical flood story shares a source with the Babylonian flood story, if Noah and Utnapishtim are literary cousins, Does that make the biblical story less true? I think this question is asked from a framework that is too small. We tend to think of religious truth as exclusive. My story is true, your story is borrowed. If yours came first, mine must be a copy. But this is not how living religious traditions work. This is not how sacred literature has ever worked. The ancient Israelites were not naive. They lived in a world saturated with flood mythology. They knew the Babylonian stories. And when they sat down to tell their own story, the story of who their God was, what their God valued, what it meant to be chosen and to survive, they used the language and the structure that their world already understood, and they transformed it. The God of the Hebrew flood is not the God of the Babylonian flood. The Babylonian gods were noisy, petty, and ultimately indifferent to human suffering. They flooded the world because humans were too loud and kept them awake. They were angry that so many people had died. They had not planned well. The God of Noah grieves. He is morally serious. He keeps his covenant. He places a rainbow in the sky as a promise to himself. I will never do this again. That is not the act of a capricious deity. It is the act of a God who is in relationship with creation, who feels the weight of what has been lost, and who binds himself to mercy. Same flood, completely different God. The Israelites took a universal human story and filled it with their specific, radical, world-changing theology. That is not plagiarism. That is revelation. And I think the same thing can be said for every tradition that carries this story. The flood narrative is a vessel, like the ark itself, and every culture puts its own sacred cargo inside it. What they load onto the boat tells you everything about what they believe. There is an image I keep coming back to. Imagine you are standing on a mountain somewhere in the ancient world. The waters are receding. Everything you knew is gone. You have survived something that was not survivable. And you are standing on a small patch of dry ground, watching the flood pull back from the edges of a world that has been remade. And you make an offering. You say thank you to whatever power it was that carried you through this moment. This moment of gratitude on the other side of catastrophe is in every flood story, in every tradition, in every civilization that ever looked at the sky after the rain and said, I am still here. 200 cultures, 10,000 years, the same gesture. I do not think that is an accident. I think it is a memory, a deep human bone-level memory of surviving something we should not have survived. And the gratitude that follows and the commitment whispered to the sky, carved into clay, chanted in temples, written in scripture, to not waste the life that was given back to us. Whatever faith you hold, whatever tradition you come from, whatever water you have walked through in your own life, that commitment is yours too. Step off the ark, touch the ground, and build something worth building. This has been First Beliefs. If this episode moved something in you, share it with someone who is asking the same questions you are. And if you want to keep going deeper into the stories that shaped the ancient world and the beliefs that shaped us, subscribe and stay close. There is so much more to uncover.